Welcome back to the Marvel Movie Minute, a daily podcast in which we dig in deep to analyze the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe 1 minute at a time. I'm Andy Nilsson from thenextreel.com. We are, of course, talking about Jon Favreau's 2008 film Iron Man. Kicking off this week with me is, once again, Matthew Westfox from the Superhero Ethics Podcast. Hey, Matthew.
Hey, thank you so much for having me back. I've had a lot of fun talking about the last couple of minutes and looking forward to really getting into the meat of this press conference.
Definitely. We're going to do that today. We are in minute 46. The minute starts with Tony talking about his daddy issues at his love-in, and it ends with Obadiah playing daddy and stepping in to spoil the fun. So yeah, this is, we really do get into the meat of this press conference here. This is, we were talking about it last time, that kind of almost like this rift in his mind as to how he feels about his father and the love he has for his father. But here he kicks us off in this minute saying, I would have asked him how he felt about what this company did, if he was conflicted, if he ever had doubts, or maybe he was every inch the man we all remember from the newsreels. And I think that's a really interesting way to start this press conference off, and this whole idea of loving this man who also was a weapons manufacturer and making weapons that kill these people. And as Tony saw, weapons that the enemies had gotten a hold of and were actually killing these Americans. And it becomes this place. And as Tony says, I had become part of a system that is comfortable with zero accountability.
I'd written down those exact words. Yeah, they're so vital to what's happening here.
Yeah, really. It makes for such an interesting conflict in a character. And I don't know, for me, it wasn't something I was expecting from a superhero film.
So I want to dive into that, but I want to start even by one, it's a throwaway line that you mentioned, but that I think actually says so much about his relationship with his father, which is where he says, how much is he the man we all remember from the film reels? And to me, that really struck me because I think if I grew up with a father who also happened to be on film a lot, but I grew up with him, my memories of him aren't from the film, they're from my memories of him. And part of what we learn later about him and Tony, but that I think is kind of being hinted at even here, is that Howard Stark was a fairly distant father. And I think part of what we're getting at is that Tony was his son and certainly has some personal memories of him, but that in some ways, Tony's memories of him are just as much the romanticized film reel images of everybody else's. And that, again, there maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it really struck me as this very sad moment of him kind of acknowledging that he knew his father, that he kind of knew his father, the celebrity, as much as he knew his father, like just the man, which I thought was a very telling moment.
Well, especially when it's a father who dies when Tony's a young man.
Right.
And Tony never really gets to know him on that adult level, and so he really, he knew him as a kid and growing up, and obviously Tony was a genius and he was inventing robots and he was doing things with his dad, and obviously kind of fit well in kind of the whole gestalt of what Stark Industries was doing with the military and designing technology and all that. He was a natural fit.
Right.
And to that end, I think that all makes sense. But he was a kid, and, as a kid genius who's designing all this stuff, perhaps he wasn't necessarily needing as much love directly from his father as a kid, but it really ends up showing, and I think this is one of those moments where Tony's reflecting on some of that, and maybe it's kind of his Charles Foster Kane moment where he's reminiscing about his past and he's like, there wasn't that connection and I wish there was more. And I always felt like there was more, but now that I'm looking at it, there really wasn't quite as much as I really wanted and probably needed.
Yeah.
It's touching.
I think it's a very good point, especially in terms of what the larger point you were making. To me, we talked about in the last 2 minutes that Tony and I'm sure you guys have talked about some of the minutes up till now, that so much of Tony's character up to this point is a person who doesn't ask questions. He has all these great things in his life. Many of them he's earned. Many of them were just given to him. And he doesn't ask about, does this reporter really feel comfortable with this? He doesn't ask about who am I selling the weapons to? He's just doing things. And to me, this moment of now he's starting to ask the questions. And so the next thing he wonders is, would his father ask these same questions? That to me is a really striking moment because, as you said, this is the moment when he's really having to wonder, and now he wants everyone else to wonder, was his dad the hero everyone thought he was? Or was there maybe something else going on? He doesn't say that his dad was living with zero accountability, but that's a pretty strong implication, and certainly that everybody around him was. And I think that's a really powerful idea of, wondering at what, in science, I think we always talk about the two different questions are, can you do something, and then should you do something? And I have the ethical bent, so that's always where I come down on it. And I think this is the moment where Tony is realizing maybe his father, and thus him as well, got so focused on the can we make this bigger weapon, this better weapon, they never asked should we.
Yeah, and Tony even says earlier in the film, he says, that's the way Dad did it, that's the way I've done it, and it's worked out pretty well so far.
Right.
It's like he hasn't really thought about any of it. It's just, this is what works. This is just the way we do it, and it works, and we're just going to keep doing it. And I think that says a lot about who he is. And I think actually the film makes that point very nicely over we're minute 46, all the minutes up to this point where we see him as a playboy and we get this sense of, he's living the high life and he doesn't think about any of this stuff. And that really kind of is the foundation for this character arc that we're going to see with Tony Stark as he goes on this journey, and everything that he's learned from Yinsen and all of the stuff that he's seen as a captive with all the people in the military who were killed using his weapons and just the vast supply of Stark weapons that they had. It all speaks to who he is becoming and this change that is happening within him.
Oh, yeah.
It's really interesting. And we do, this is another point that we talked about a couple days ago. We have a shot of Terrence Howard, who he came in late to the meeting in the last minute. And we see him here as he's reacting to Tony, as Tony speaks. And he, as a representative of the military, has a look on his face like, he's a little worried about where this is going. It's kind of an interesting way to play this.
Yeah, I thought so. And one thing I'm particularly glad you pointed that out is because we get three distinct characters all reacting to Tony. And I hope we'll talk about all three. Obadiah gives a look, Rhodey gives a look, and then later Pepper gives a look. And Obadiah's, I think, clearly is kind of wrapped up in his own story of him having a lot of fear of where Tony's going. Rhodey's is very interesting because I think you're right. He's up until now, I think he earlier refers to himself as Tony's babysitter, as feeling like he's got to always take care of Tony. And I think that, at least as I understood it, Rhodey is having this dual moment of, on the one hand, Tony is asking questions that Rhodey really doesn't want to think about because they're undermining everything Rhodey does in terms of his own life with the military. But I also wonder if on some level he's just kind of like, wait a minute, where's my friend the playboy? I have for so long been wishing my friend would grow up, wishing my friend would take some more responsibility, and now he's kind of doing that. And as we see throughout these movies, Rhodey winds up being really conflicted, but then eventually being very much on Tony's side. And I think you start to see a little bit of that in that look, because there's the concern, but also there's the, wait a minute, this is the person I've been wanting Tony to be for a while now. And not necessarily that he wanted Tony to question the military, but that he wanted Tony to question something, to think about something, and not just to kind of go along with whatever the moment said.
You're right. I mean, most of that moment with him, I guess I spoke a little early. I mean, a lot of that's going to happen in tomorrow's minute. We'll see a lot of that look. But I think there's a lot of power in these looks. And you're right. Obadiah has some really great looks as he is the one who is the most wary with everything. He walks into this press conference completely just on, you could say he's a little on edge because he doesn't know where Tony's going with this whole thing, why he called this press conference. And it's a really interesting way that Jeff Bridges plays it, because he is really policing Tony, even though he's acting like he's not policing Tony. But when he hears Tony start saying some of the stuff that he's saying about shutting down the weapons manufacturing division and all of that, it's he's rubbing his lip and he's wiping his forehead and he's jumping up and kind of taking over the podium to kind of try, as we were talking about a couple minutes ago, how he's really trying to control the situation and make sure that he's the one who's still in charge. And it's nice the way that he kind of leaps up to kind of, again, try to take charge and be the one who's who's making the smart business decisions for the company, because he no longer is a guy who's running on his own ethics. It's all about the corporate bottom line.
And to me, there's two big things I get out of this. One is we were talking before about how at what point do you, the audience, start to think Obadiah is clearly not just the villain, an antagonist, and that he's out for profit, but that he is the villain, the person who becomes Ironmonger. This, to me, is one more scene where, and as you were saying, I think when we talked about last week, that for a while they weren't sure if he would do that or if he would be more of a light antagonist. This is another scene where I think it would still work just as well, even if he wasn't behind the plot to kill Tony and all this, because I can 100% believe Obadiah being utterly still like happy that Tony is back, wanting Tony to be okay, but terrified that Tony is potentially going to torpedo the company that Obadiah is in charge of. And so that's the first thing I get there. And the second is, I had not thought of it in those terms before, but what you said about Obadiah like daddying Tony. We've talked so much about how up until this point, Tony has never really taken any adult responsibility and how Tony is kind of this man-child. I think part of what we see in this moment is Obadiah has been actively trying to keep him a man-child for a very long time.
Yeah,
and
right.
Now part of what's happening is Tony is starting to act like a grown-up and to ask real questions. And like you said, Obadiah wants to jump right up because he doesn't want Tony thinking these big adult thoughts. He wants Tony, doing the genius things in the lab and not asking any questions.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way that relationship works, and the way that he is really trying to run things from behind the scenes. He very much wants to be the Wizard of Oz, right? He wants to be the man behind the curtains who's secretly running everything, and likely has been that for a very long time, because Tony kind of runs things off the cuff and isn't really paying attention to things. And I think that Obadiah likely has been making a killing, I guess you could say, by running the business this way and doing a very effective job keeping the weapons manufacturing division working very effectively. And this point is kind of a big shift, and it's interesting to see it play. It's funny. Where were you as far as your understanding of the Iron Man comics and all of the lore of Iron Man before you walked into this movie? Did you know anything about the characters in kind of that universe?
Not very much. I knew the song by Led Zeppelin, which I thought was a lot more connected, and realized later it wasn't, and was deeply frustrated throughout the movie that we never heard it until we finally got it at the very end. But I knew that he was a kind of a superhero, billionaire, playboy that, I thought of him as kind of a Batman analog in that regard, who had basically bought his way into the superpowers that other people had. And I knew that he was connected to this larger thing called S.H.I.E.L.D. and to all these other heroes. And I kind of knew vaguely about like some of the Avenger stuff and things like that. But that's basically all I knew.
I'm pretty much right there with you. And so I really had no idea who Stane was. I didn't know who he was. I knew who Jeff Bridges was. I didn't have a sense of him as the antagonist in the film. I really just, I didn't get enough. I had no idea, because anyone who had read the comics and who knew who Obadiah Stane was would pretty much know walking into this, that as soon as you hear that name come up, that, oh, this is going to be the antagonist, or at least one of the antagonists, because he's a pretty big player in the comics. But I had none of that. So walking into this, I felt like the film was setting me up for one of those stories where we were going to have two antagonists. One would be kind of the business world antagonist, which would be Obadiah Stane, and then the bad guy antagonist, who would probably be Raza, because Raza seemed to be, at this point, the most antagonist character that we've seen in the film thus far. And so I really didn't know where the film was taking me. And I wouldn't have been surprised if it continued that way. And we had one of those films that ended where you've got Obadiah trying to take over, and at the end of the film, Tony is able to take back control of the company while also defeating the villain. It just so happens that the way they made it, Obadiah was both. It's interesting. I just never, I guess in my head, I never pieced all of that together.
No, I think I was kind of a similar place. And I think at one of the later minutes we're going to talk about in a couple of days is when I first started to think maybe Obadiah is really the full villain. But I certainly didn't think so during this press conference. As you said, I kind of saw him as the corporate antagonist instead of the real fighting. Basically, I sort of saw that Obadiah was Tony Stark's antagonist, and Raza was Iron Man's antagonist.
Right.
I think it's also, though, because, and here again, this is where I've talked about this before, but the way in which I feel like this movie sets the tone so well for so much of the rest of the MCU, I think part of it's because I didn't expect a comic book movie to have that level of subtlety.
Yeah.
And it's funny because now, having watched so many of the rest of the movies, I go back and I rewatch it. I'm like, oh my God, they're hitting me over the head so much with how much of a bad guy Obadiah is. But I think when I watched this movie, it felt much more subtle to me because compared to the comic book movies we'd had before, it really was. This idea of playing with who's the bad guy and who's the good guy, and could there be multiple bad guys doing things for different reasons and them not always understanding each other. I really like that.
Especially in a film that starts off with a character who essentially could have become one of the bad guys, because Tony already is in the same mindset as Obadiah Stane.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's interesting to see this character who kind of switches over from that mindset. And the only reason really that Obadiah becomes the bad guy is because Tony stops being a bad guy. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think, it's one of those things where like Tony and Obadiah are marching in lockstep. It's just that Tony stops. And granted, Obadiah has this whole plot to kill Tony and things like that.
Right. There's that.
But I think it's because, there's that scene much earlier in the movie where the reporter confronts Tony. And I remember every time I see it, I don't think the reporter's wrong. Like, I think she's kind of a little bit ridiculous in how she's going about it and wound up sleeping with him and stuff like that. But I think the questions she's asking him are dead on accurate.
Yeah, right. Speaking of reporters, we do have a number of them in this scene, although very few are actually credited. The credited reporters are Patrick O'Connell, Adam J. Harrington, Mira Simhan, and Ben Newmark, who are all four of them are right up in the very front. And Ben is actually the one who speaks to Tony and asks him what happened over there. And actually, Tony says, "Hey, Ben." So obviously his character name shouldn't just be reporter. It's Ben the reporter.
Right.
So kind of funny. We do have a number of other people who are uncredited who are also in the reporter scene. Dr. Mark W. Berry, Kristen J. Hooper, Flavia Maines Rossi, Robert McMurray, Nick Nicholson, Elijah Samuel Quesada, and Chris Reed. Although some of them have pictures on IMDb, some don't. There are so many people in this room that it is really hard to pinpoint who's who and where they are. So I kind of gave up after a little bit trying to figure it out.
I can understand that.
I'm sure they're all there. They're either here or they may be in the end scene or they may be in both. It's, there's so many reporters. It's hard to say.
Right.
Other than that, the other thing that I was going to mention is it's interesting how Tony ends up almost having a more vulnerable breakdown in the script than he does here. He does, like I said, it feels like there's this element of PTSD with the way that he's acting, but he still seems focused and he seems like he has an idea as to what he wants to accomplish here. The way he starts out in the script, it says Tony gazes out over the reporters. Suddenly he seems vulnerable, scattered. The silence grows awkward. Obadiah is mercifully going to save him when Tony says, "I can't do this anymore." Pregnant silence, everyone waiting for the stark punchline. Finally, a reporter ventures, "You mean you're retiring?" And then Tony says, "No, I don't want to retire. I want to do something else." "Something besides weapons?" "Yes, that's right." And it's just, it's interesting how, it kind of builds from there in a similar path, but it's interesting how, again, there's just a subtle difference in the way the script plays out as opposed to the way the film ends up playing out. And it's subtle enough where I feel like they really made the right decisions and they came to it. I don't know at what point. I don't know if this was a last minute thing. According to Jeff Bridges, a lot of these changes were kind of on the seat of their pants and kind of creating frustrating situations for the actors. But still, I think they made the right decisions and I think it plays out nicely. I like seeing, even though Tony is acting strange and he's doing this whole love-in thing, it seems like he's in charge and he's not just lost and flustering,
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I was saying a lot of things earlier about how Tony, to me, in all of this is kind of trying to shirk responsibility. Not shirk, that makes it sound like a bad thing, but he doesn't want as much responsibility. He doesn't want to have as much power. But I feel like that version of the script would make it seem like he really doesn't have any power in the situation.
Yeah.
And I like that here we see he really does still have the power. He's sitting down because he wants to be on their level, but they still all sit down with him,
Right.
It sets up that thing of like, he creates Ultron because he doesn't want to be the one to make the final decision, but yet it's his decision unilaterally to do that, him having the power, him having the power in Civil War. Like, to me, the biggest thing I get out of him in Civil War is him saying, I need a daddy. I need someone else to tell me when to use my power and when not, because I know I'm going to use my power and I don't trust myself with that.
Yeah, right.
And yeah, I think that's what you're saying there is a really good point, because he wants to change things, but he still does have all the power.
Yeah, he's a very interesting character, and it's going to be, as we've said in past minutes, it'll be interesting to follow him over the progression of his character arc through this franchise and see how he's growing and changing and kind of redefining what he needs and how he works to get it.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have anything else for this minute. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, there were two quick things I wanted to comment on.
Sure.
One was, and we went into it a lot last minute, so I won't rehash it, but just that line you mentioned about being comfortable with zero accountability.
Right.
To me, it again it reinforces the thing that made me, as kind of someone who likes to see movies that talk about our own world, really fall in love with this movie. Was, you think about this movie was being made in 2008. This was the time when we were still, as a culture and a country, still talking about our involvement in Afghanistan, our involvement in Iraq, and what should our military be doing or not doing. And I feel like for the movie to have a character at that time and place be saying, I've seen what our weapons are doing in Afghanistan, I'm not sure if that's a good idea, that's a very bold move at a time when a lot of these movies didn't want to in any way be controversial, in any way be seen as too conservative or too liberal. And it just made me really happy that the movie was kind of continuing that the Stan Lee tradition of, yeah, comic books are supposed to be commentary on our own world and not just escapism.
That's a great point. And the way that that's going to kind of develop and shape over the course of the films will be interesting. But it certainly is interesting just within this one. And I think Tony is really the perfect character for us to have these conversations and to kick it off, because he is a weapons manufacturer. Yeah. And you don't get those sorts of conversations really coming out of like Spider-Man or something like that. The totally different types of conversations you're having with those films. This is a great film that allows these stories to kind of give us that real connection to the real world and what's going on in the real world. And it just puts that in that perspective that makes you think a little bit about some of the stuff that's going on.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And just the last thing I want to comment on, and here's where maybe I'm going to do my only like kind of second by second analysis. But toward the very end of this minute, we talk about the look that Obadiah gives and the look that Rhodey gives. Starting in second 53, 54, Pepper gives a reaction. Yeah. And she had a kind of concerned look early on. But this look really struck me because, and maybe again, I'm seeing what I want to see. What I see is her being very like surprised, but a little bit of a smile starting on her face. Like, to me, we've known that she's kind of a little bit frustrated with Tony, and she kind of thinks Tony can be more than he is. And I mentioned this with Rhodey, but I think especially with Pepper, I think she's surprised, but I think she's a little bit impressed that he is starting to actually have some accountability and have some responsibility. I really like that look on her face, because to me it really sets up where she's going to stand, and that she actually kind of that she's probably one of the ones who is most wanting him to take this new direction in things.
Yeah, right. Even though she is in his employ and kind of works under this umbrella of Stark Industries and has a successful career because of it, you're right. There's an element of that connection between the two of them that I do feel, you're right, it probably does. She probably does have this sense that she's would like to see something change.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. I'm looking forward to talking a little bit more of that tomorrow in tomorrow's minute, because I believe it's tomorrow's minute when the press conference will end and there will be a scripted moment with her that that's not in the film. We can talk about that and see how it ties in with your thoughts on this.
Nice.
Perfect. All right, Matthew. Well, where can people find you? You want to remind everybody again?
Yeah. So I have a podcast with my colleague Jacob Malicic, and the earlier host was Paul Hoppy. It's at Superhero Ethics. You can find it on iTunes and Stitcher and some of the other podcast catchers. You can also find us at www.superheroethics.com. And then that name, Superhero Ethics, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter. I will say someone else has written a book called Superhero Ethics. That is not me. That is not us. That is a very different direction. We had sort of cornered the market on the podcast thing, but turns out someone can legally still use the name for a book. So more power to them, but that is not us. Superhero Ethics. And you can also, I should have mentioned this on other times, but you can also email us at superheroethics@gmail.com. We always love ideas about things that we should be podcasting about. We tend to talk about ethical and moral questions from DC, MCU, Star Trek, Star Wars, a kind of broad range of fantasy and sci-fi and superhero stuff. So thank you for having me on this podcast, and I hope some of your fans want to check us out. And if you do, please let us know what you think.
Fantastic. All right, everybody. Well, that is it for today's show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, make sure you subscribe to the show for free over at marvelmovieminute.com. And you can join us in our Discord chat room. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Next Reel. And of course, you can go over to patreon.com/thenextreel if you want to support us and get some cool stuff. Until next time, true believers.